Good morning, everyone joining and sure any even maybe Poland, like myself. My current hair color is a bit of a letdown probably for you because it's already washed out and more on like tilted towards the bubblegum shade. But you gotta believe me, it was true at one point. And today I'm going to talk about shades of how our brains work, different shades, the diversity of our brains, and how we can address it with the content we design as content designers and designers in general. And before we dive in, I would like to start with a tiny bit of introduction about why I'm talking about this subject. So as you already know, I am a content designer currently working at a health tech company called Doc Planner, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as it's important in today's context. As introduced, I'm also a UX writing trainer and a university lecturer, just starting another semester of classes, which will also involve the topic we're going to talk about today. And most importantly, in today's context, I am a psychologist by training. I graduated in psychology. And during my psychology studies, I learned a lot about describing how our brains work, and the descriptions used in that context were fairly negative. We're talking a lot about disorders, like personality disorders, about illnesses. We're talking a lot about what makes people impaired. And the idea behind this, the angle behind this is called pathogenesis, which is fairly common in the medical world, where we focus on the cause behind the disease. But as psychologists, as people who, even though I'm not a clinical psychologist myself, but as psychologists, as people who take care of well-being, we focus on yet another angle, which is the salutogenesis, the cause behind health. And coming from that angle, coming from what makes us highly functioning people who can develop their potential, we come to a model called the social model of disability. When we don't treat people as machines that are impaired or malfunctioning, we treat people as people who are diverse, who can function well if they are in the right environment. We don't focus on changing the people themselves. We focus on changing the society, on designing the society so that it can serve them better. And this is what we do. This is what we are supposed to do as designers. We address the neurodiversity, a term which many of you might be already familiar with, but just to make sure we are all on the same page, we're going to define it very briefly as a wide range of variations in the human brain. And the variations are the keyword here. Variations, not flaws. Variations are not negative. Variations are neutral in its essence. And when we look at what falls under the neurodiversity spectrum, you might often find people who are diagnosed somewhere on the autism spectrum at some point. You might find people with attention deficits such as ADHD or ADD. You might find people with dyslexia, which like applies to how we read, with dysgraphia, which applies to writing, or dyscalculia, which of course, applies to how we calculate. And if we go one step further, it's more and more common that people with mental health conditions, as you will see, it's pretty hard to find language that's truly neutral. We're talking about mental health, people with OCD, bipolar disorders, or affective disorders such as depression. This is also considered in the neurodiverse view and as a different way our brains work and a way we need to address as designers. And of course, these are just a few examples. There are many, many more things that fall under the umbrella. There are two things we need to consider as designers not to fall into some common pitfalls. First thing is that neurodiversity often comes in pairs or in groups, and there isn't really such thing as designing specifically for people with ADHD or people on the autism spectrum, because many of these many of these diagnoses come together. For instance, out of 10 people with ADHD, more than half of the people in the group also display autism spectrum traits, and it often works the other way around as well. The second thing is that neurodiversity is far from being an edge case. It's not designing for some sort of really small group of people. Rather than that, it's designing for approximately 15 to 20% of the world's population, as many people who can be considered as neuroatypical, as neurodiverse, are not yet diagnosed or will never be diagnosed in the course of their lives. And this is what we think about a lot at my current workplace, the Dog Planner Group. We are, as I said, we are a health tech company, and we develop a wide range of health tech related products. And the biggest one being a marketplace where patients can book visits, schedule a procedure with a doctor or another healthcare professional. And when we look at the list of most commonly searched diseases and conditions, we see a pattern. We see that many of these conditions apply to the way our brains work, apply to anxiety, apply to depression. And even when we look at COVID, we realize that it can also be about cognitive implications, such as long COVID and the way it affects our brains' work. And we don't even need to think too hard and look too deep to realize that we have a tremendous impact on people's quality of life. When we look at the insights we get from our customers, we see people with ADHD speaking clearly that their app helps them manage their procrastination, as we call it, and we can really make their lives better. And what I would really encourage you to do is to look through feedback you get from your customers, from the people you design for, and see what you're going to find out, and then to share it with other people in your company for them to see that they have this power in their hands as developers and as designers. This screenshot comes from an Oakland company meeting we had, I think 1 week ago. This was the last slide I added to this presentation, just because I realized this is so prevalent. And it is for us to realize that we don't design for perfectly focused and relaxed people no matter as much as we want to. We always design for uncertainty and limited attention. People don't use our products in perfect conditions with huge screens, with perfect contrast, sitting straight. We always design for some sort of frustration and some levels of stress. And then we get to a point when we think what we can do as designers and as content designers specifically. Me as a content designer working mainly with words, I can look for good practices. I can look for at the W3C website. I can look for accessibility guidelines. I find a lot of guidelines, but mostly related to visuals, to contrast, which is, I think, already can be considered common knowledge, but there isn't that much to find when it comes to content, the way we design information, the way we write. And this is why I'm doing this talk today, and I'm going to share some insights with you, some quotes from people I talked to. I talked to 18 different people who got some sort of diagnosis related to the neurodiversity spectrum, and I'm going to show you some good practices and examples you can use in your day-to-day work. First insight that was repeated in every interview I conducted was the need to provide clear instructions. And this is especially important for people who fall on the autism spectrum or were diagnosed with dyslexia, because if we don't do this, they, as they say, are very much likely to drop filling out the form. And the way to do it is, of course, using lists and bullet points, which is quite common, good practice when it comes to content design and plain language. But there's one more thing, if we have different options and the instructions get a little bit more complicated, it's a good idea to use tables, if/then tables that look like this. If we have different options, then we can divide them into two very clear paths to make it easier to follow the steps and to decrease the number of decisions someone has to make, like in this example. And this is what it looks like in one of the instructions I was using recently, the prototype manual, when they did just that. Another thing when it comes to these instructions is to reduce the probability that we will need to display an error message. And although it might seem obvious that we don't want to ask people to remember things, it's quite easy to forget, which is quite ironic, I believe. And this is why it's important to list all necessary details up front before we even need to produce an error message. And this is quite well done by HubSpot in this example. Just a side note from my side that when it comes to numerals, it's much easier. They are much easier to read if we use numbers like they did here, but not here. So just like a readability note from a content designer, obviously. And going to the next step, there's the thing about uncertainty, about people who like to plan how they are going to get to an on-site event. This is about bridging the gap between online and offline experiences. It might be already quite stressful for many people just to go outside and mingle and like find the building first and know how to enter a building. So we as content designers who create experiences might address it and provide instructions so that people don't stress and can focus on enjoying that experience, like the person who provided this quote. Same applies to e-commerce stores. This is a subject that keeps popping up every time I research this. People really don't like it when they don't find necessary information at the right time. Then before they get to the final step, which is the checkout, they need to live with some uncertainty that could be easily addressed if we mention the delivery time, for example, like here, before the checkout. And this is how we can do it. Like Katawiki, bidding website for vintage items mostly. I think it's very well designed when it comes to this particular subject, because when we look at it closely, we have a lot of scannable item details. There's a lot of information that's quite easy to access thanks to these clear labels and the whole architecture. We have the shipping cost before we even start bidding, which is super important, especially if I want to bid for something that's not in my country. And of course, there's the delivery time. So again, a lot of information, but all structured in a way that can reduce the uncertainty. Another thing is about making the purpose clear. And this is just one of the quotes I got about the mismatch between the title and the content. For instance, when the title says live stream and there's a picture of the live stream. So about matching the titles and what's below them. And when looking for good examples, in that case, I really recommend this often overlooked part of the W3C website about making content usable for people with cognitive and learning disabilities. I think it's not as popular as it should be, so that's why I'm bringing that one up. And it's pretty nice to scan and to look for specific examples because they quote a lot of their research, the insights from the user test, and some phenomena they're talking about. So I really recommend this one as a resource. Another thing we should remember about as designers and as content designers as well, because it's often related to the content itself, it's to remind what's going on during the journey. And this quote here is about the journey as well. This quote comes from a person who bought the wrong train ticket 3 times because they were not reminded what they are buying, and we cannot really blame them for it. because why don't we remind people? We know that they are not 100% focused on what they are doing, and that's okay. We are not the most important thing in their lives, so it's absolutely expected that we'll remind them, we'll kind of make sure that they are doing the right thing. They can receive the confirmation, and this is what Finnair does in their shopping process. When we book a flight, which already can be kind of stressful because they cost a lot, there's a lot of details to remember about, but they show on all the trip details here on the right side at different steps of the journey. So we don't ask the people to remember the departure times, the hours, all the ticket types, the stops, the class, the other details. They are all here waiting on the right side. And when it comes to the way we display the content, the way we format the text, there is a very strong preference for dropping justification, especially among people with dyslexia, but this also applies to people on the autism spectrum. People say openly that justified text makes the letters jump in front of their eyes, and it's easy to see that when we have varying spaces, the readability is decreased, like in this example, when it's much harder to scan the text in the example on the left than the one here on the right. So no matter the aesthetic preferences when it comes to good practices regarding accessibility and being neurodiversity friendly, justifying has to go. and going a bit away from the text itself, it's also good to talk about how different people like to access content. It's not that reading is the default way to access content for everyone, and some people really prefer voice search. That's why some people win. Some products win because they are better accessible with voice search, like in this case. And some people really like to choose an option that's not a video. And this person is also myself, although I don't have any diagnosis that would fall under on the neurodiversity spectrum. I will do everything in my power to skip watching a video, and I will look for a written version. So I can absolutely relate to that. And even if we have a material that's a video, it's also a good practice to use closed captions, not just subtitles, but closed captions with sound descriptions, because some people on the neurodiversity spectrum find it hard to focus just on the sound, to process just the sound only. And when it comes to closed captions, it's a good practice to keep them up to 40 characters per line. This might be also a familiar number to some of you, especially the content designers, because this is also a suggested character limit for microcopy in interfaces. So that's pretty easy to remember, and to keep them up to 2 lines of similar length. And here's a source if you would like to learn more about closed captions, if this is something that would be particularly useful for you. And another good news is that this recommendation goes beyond neurodiversity. It's also there's also a strong generational preference for closed captions, for subtitles among Gen Z, and you can see it very clearly in the reports as one of the main trends. So you're also being up to date if you start doing that. And most of all, there's this one common preference to keep it simple. And people say openly that the simpler the copy, the better. This is helpful for people, for dyslexic people, for people on the autism spectrum as well, and ADHD. So this serves a very wide group of people. And to keep things simple and pay attention to consistency, it really helps to use product glossaries, to have a list of the names of items you use in your product. So even if you're not content designers, it really pays off to note down what the elements of your system are called. Even if you don't have a content designer on board, I would really recommend doing that early in the process. So then you will find it much easier to get rid of all the inconsistencies. A general content design tip, really. There are, of course, tools to keep your language simple, plain language tools such as Hemingway, and they're great, but again, they are just algorithms, and I really recommend testing your copy with real users, see what are the preferences to make sure you're really hitting the spot. And when it comes to sources about design for neurodiversity specifically, there is this one pretty new website called neurodiversity.design. It's still in beta, but even at this stage, there's plenty of interesting insights in there about the fonts, about typography, about interfaces in general, and other things that designers should find useful. So I recommend this one resource as well. And at this point, you might be thinking, all right, but aren't these general guidelines? And you would be right, because they should be. This is the whole idea behind considering neurodiversity in design. This is why we're doing this, because if we make things friendly for people who fall on the neurodiversity spectrum, people who are considered neuroatypical, we also make these designs friendly for a wider group of people. And the reason why we're talking about this is that what is a minor inconvenience for yourself or for myself can be a critical error for someone else. What can be just like a tiny problem for us might mean that someone won't be able to finish their journey, to finish what they came for. And this is why it's worth keeping different perspectives and the diversity of human brains in mind. And to wrap it up, I would like to talk a little bit about representation, another keyword here, and diverse recruitment. First of all, having diverse teams, which we already talked a little bit about today. Having diverse teams also when it comes to neurodiversity. In my current design team, I have several people with ADHD, with diagnosed ADHD. I am also working with a dyslexic content designer, which I believe is a blessing. It's great to have a dyslexic person on the content design team, because you can already test how dyslexic people read. So that's, I think, absolutely brilliant. I also work with a person who's colorblind, and I believe it's super helpful for designers. It really broadens your perspective. So I highly recommend hiring colorblind designers as well. And when it comes to working with neuroatypical people with neurodiversity, there's of course the need for respect for boundaries and needs, for the fact that some people might want to take part in meetings maybe less frequently. Maybe they will need more time to work alone, or maybe their needs will be just different. The idea is to be respectful towards each other and to listen to each other. And I think this quote, which you might already know, but I believe it really shows the idea behind what I was saying, is this quote from Dr. Stephen Shore, who says that when you know one person with autism, you know one person with autism. And that's why it's always a good idea to ask respectfully and to respect someone's preferences. And same applies to research participants. When we recruit people for research, test our designs, it's important to ask not about their labels, but specific preferences, as they might be using different labels, or they might not want to choose any labels at all. It's good to ask about what you prefer, or what you might find frustrating, or what you might find distracting in the process, not to ask about what do you like as a person with ADHD. It's better to ask about like specific behaviors and preferences, and also to respect breaks and silence. Don't rush the process. People might have a different dynamic, and that's perfectly okay. And don't force eye contact. Isn't the thing about, isn't they are being rude. They just might find it uncomfortable, and that's also perfectly okay. This is inspired by a talk from a neuroatypical researcher from Poland, and I left a link for you to her Polish website. I think Google Translate will do the trick here. I tested it myself, and it still makes a lot of sense. So you might be able to to bridge that gap. And again, we talk about how the social model of disability and the concept of neurodiversity is about not asking people to adapt to the environment, to the design, but instead to our mission as designers is to adapt our designs to people. And this is what I would like to end this presentation with as a designer, as a content designer, and as a UX professional. I really hope this has been helpful for you. Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here with you tonight or this morning, depending on the time zone. And if you would like to talk, I will be available on Slack and on LinkedIn, whatever works for you. Thank you very much and have a wonderful day ahead.